I'm really pleased to be able to be in conversation with Zoe, whose work I've followed for quite a long time, and I always find it so stimulating and extraordinary. And it's something about that, the conscientiousness of the research base, but then the way it's translated into exhibition form and the accompanying books and the films that one can access online means, in a sense, it allows you to think other things out of the materials that have been digested and pulled around and worked on. So I just wanted to say thank you for your work and for this opportunity. So the exhibition's called Emotions Go to Work. So we're going to have a free-ranging discussion between ourselves about those themes, and we haven't really plotted it out, but one thing I wanted just to start with to kick things off was I was really interested in the kind of timeline of things, because in some ways this exhibition is really, or the research basis is really strongly about the present and the ways in which emotions are being mobilized and monetized in the present, and I'm sure we'll come to talk about that. But at the same time, as often with your work, there's also this longer back history. We go back to Marais and the motion capture in the 19th century, and we have cartoons from the earlier part of the 20th century. So my first question was about that historical span. Is it that emotions in some form or another have always been put to work, or they've always been put to work since the 19th century, or is that just somehow to cast into relief the particular ways in which emotions are put to work now?
These are huge questions, and I just want to start by saying that Esther's work has actually inspired me a lot since I first discovered it like 20 years ago. And she wrote an amazing book called Hollywood Flatlands about animation and critical theory. And I was just like, if I was an intellectual, I would write that book. But I'm so glad she did. And it's been kind of an inspiration for me ever since. And you'll see some of the, the way I work with cartoons and so on is very much inspired by her thinking. So it's really going to be a dialogue. It's not just, we find ourselves working on many similar themes. So I think we should start a little bit by talking what it means what I mean by emotions go to work. Like, how are our emotions, how can they become valuable assets? I mean, it's kind of a weird, non-intuitive idea. We have feelings, we're happy, we're sad, we're frustrated. Like, how do those things make money? Like, what do we mean by that? It's really odd, and I had to kind of dig into like how that happens. And you're doing something similar, which is like, I mean, on a very simple level, if large companies can capture our feelings, what we wish for, think, long for, desire, and so on, they can use that to sell things to us. So that's a very simple, when we like things on Facebook, Facebook knows how to sell things that we might like even more. So it becomes kind of like an ever-expanding loop of desires and things and so on. So that's one way that our emotions are useful to large corporate entities. But in order for that to happen, and it goes way beyond that today, and I think it will go, I mean, in my exhibition, I, being an artist, get to speculate, so it goes to me from the middle of the 19th century into the future, because I can, I think academics, are you not supposed to do that? Like, do too much speculation?
Well, I ignore that rule, but in general, yes.
So I began actually in the middle of the 19th century for a reason, because I think that's the first time I was discovering that in order to to be able to monetize our feelings have to be recorded, captured, databases need to be made, and getting information from our bodies and finding that information useful, and literally putting it to work to make people more efficient, or to separate the sane from the mad, to make the working population more useful to business, to government, to the military and whatever. Our affects, which is not just like our obvious emotions, but our heart rate, our feelings, our bodily symptoms, had to be tracked and captured. I mean, just the way like a Fitbit captures your heart rate today, that didn't come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So there was work done in the middle of the 19th century, and that's why my project starts there, with, for example, the physiologist Etienne Gilles-Marais, who did various studies on how the body moves. But very quickly that became how to make the body move more efficiently, how to make French soldiers move more efficiently. So it was instrumentalized. It is not just pure scientific data. Or there's, I think, very, to put it in short form, there is a series of charts, 3 charts in my exhibition, which are to do with facial expressions. The first is based on a series of photographs taken by a French physiologist in the 1850s called Duchenne de Boulogne, who had this idea that he wanted to make a series of charts, a data, what we'd call a database, of all known human expressions. So he didn't do it by asking people to look happy or sad or whatever. He had a more quote-unquote scientific way, which was to touch people's facial muscles with electrodes, which would distort their face. He would photograph it, and then he would go, that looks a little bit like anguish tinged with melancholy, or perhaps terror tinged with forgetfulness. I mean, they were kind of strange titles that he interpreted these. So you get these great charts of facial expressions that were produced in a very kind of industrial way. And there was not much he could do with that at the time, but I began to see how those kinds of charts of facial expressions, the emotions could be mapped into a database. The next great flowering of that was actually the development of emoji, which we have all the time. He called his database an alphabet of the passions. That's exactly what emojis are today. Everybody has them on the smartphone. They're part of the Unicode alphabet. So we use them in lieu of text. They're a pictograph. So that is, again, a limited alphabet. There's only so many emojis. You can only convey so many emotions. So it limits what we can convey that we feel, which is always a little scary when alphabets start to shrink and vocabularies start to shrink to a set number. How can we convey feelings of anguish or sadness or rebellion when there just isn't a face for it? So I was interested, and emojis are not, they seem very cute, but they're not so cute. They are there to signal, as I say, on social media, not just to your friends, but to Google, to Facebook, to all those things, what you are, how you react. I mean, Facebook, there's only 6 possible choices. That's a very, very limited range of feelings that you are allowed to convey, that is permissible to convey, because there aren't pictures for anything else.
And they tend towards the positive as well. There's very little in the spectrum for negative emotion, because that's bad.
So if that is kind of the state of play today, then I started to imagine what it might be like 20, 50, 100 years from now? How could we imagine that? And you'll see a chart of like what look like faces, clouds that are faces in clouds. And I was, because we talk about cloud computing, things are stored in the cloud. And as we send these emotions to Facebook, I imagine them building up and up. And you know, we think of like the cloud as something very sweet, a little white fluffy cloud, but actually these vast, you know, international databases, they're actually ecologically filthy. You know, they're really, really bad for the planet. So I imagine dirty clouds, filthy clouds, storm clouds, kind of horrifying, anguished clouds of emotions that kind of that are another way I'm thinking about how we can find images to think about what's really happening. That is the other side of this very, as I say, whitewashed world of cloud computing. So you're talking about some similar themes about how emotions become useful. And particularly, Esther's been thinking about atmospheres and how HR, human resources, are tasked to create atmospheres, which always makes me think of like the 18th century and like gaseous matter, you know. So clouds also go back to thinking about like the invention of chemistry and gases. And I began to, do you know the story of the heirloom? Well, the first, when people like Lavoisier and so on began to study like oxygen and gases and stuff in the 18th century, it was a whole new idea to people that there were these kind of gaseous elements. And there's a first recorded case of paranoid schizophrenia, which is in London, which is a man who thought that gases was influencing his emotions. Later, like today, there's cases of paranoid schizophrenia. People think that microwaves are influencing their feelings or just changing their brains and all that kind of stuff. People often with paranoid schizophrenia kind of latch onto some explanation for something they don't understand, and they often use kind of imaginary scientific data, like half understood. But yeah, the first was like these gaseous atmospheres were like destroying his life. But in a way, atmospheres can be destructive. So maybe you want to talk a bit about atmospheres.
I mean, for me, I think I was doing a sort of parallel thing, which was to think about the kind of gaseous collocations that we might call an atmosphere, and to think about that in the present while thinking about new ways in which the atmosphere and ambience of the office is operationalized and tracked now, and the emergence of emojis into the workplace and working situations. So you have this company called Happy or Not to produce all of these buttons that you're required or requested to press after some sort of service experience going through security. You know, you've got a sort of a smiley face and the moo face, and then the upset face. And they also produce tracking programs for the employees in offices to monitor their emotions through the day. And then you have all these HR practices like team mood, which require workers to constantly report on their emotional well-being. And there are many, many technologies of this which are present and relate to our present fascination with crowds and crowdsourcing. And I wanted to track that back into the sort of generative moment of the mid-19th century when crowd theory is being proposed, and you have these sort of two streams, one of which Le Bon conceives the crowd as a mob to be controlled, and that would be precisely the reason why this data might be collected on them is sort of biometric data, in relation to which one might mention someone who doesn't come up with you, but I think is really interesting, which is Lombroso and his criminal anthropology, and he's inventing all these recording instruments to try to monitor both behaviours and states of mind and so on. So you've got that stream, and then you've got Gabriel Tard, who's much more thinking about crowds as imitative beings that are very emotional beings through which different kinds of emotions might flow, but even potentially loving, because the crowd, elements within the crowd, almost like particles within a gaseous mass, start to interact and then influence each other. So I'm sort of interested, in the way in which ideas that we might think are very, very modern and of our time have these much longer histories, and partly it is because they're enmeshed with technologies such as photography or filming that haven't gone away. They've simply repurposed themselves, and that's where it's really interesting in the exhibition, where you talk about Duchenne de Boulogne and the capturing of facial expressions, which incidentally Darwin went on to use those photographs of emotions that had been purely stimulated through electrical shock. They airbrushed out the apparatus and used them as actual images of expression in humans. So, but you can trace a line from that, as you do, right through to Paul Ekman and his work since the 1960s on facial recognition software, first, which fed into the generation of lie detectors and is now being used for these virtual border guards, eye border control, which is the latest one that's going to be placed along the borders of Europe, and in order to keep out the undesirables through this extraordinary amassing of bodily data, micro gestures, sweat, simultaneously consulting existing databases of people for their legitimacy. And so you can track this line, in which I suppose what one sees, though, is an increasing escalation. And what's quite funny, I think, what you make so graphic is the sense in which, while that becomes more and more and more sinister, more and more able to exert certain kinds of control through absolute sort of knowledge, it presents itself as more and more friendly. So these emojis in the workplace, you have this system called Slack, which is a hugely growing business system which allows employees to communicate using emojis, because that means it's like the Lego movie. We're in a fun workplace. We all love it. We're all buying overpriced lattes, or if we're really lucky, we get them for free. And we have seats at Google that swing. So we're not working, we're playing. That sense of this working on atmosphere seems to be about the capturing and the manufacture and manipulation of emotions in the workplace, as well as capturing them as resource to put to work in order to sell stuff back to us. So it sort of works at many levels, the ways in which these are being tracked and then instrumentalized.
I'm really interested also, I want to go back to Paul Ekman and emotion tracking, because I think that brings out a really interesting contradiction that again goes back to the 19th century, which is the idea that the camera can never lie. So there was this idea, for example, in the 19th century, the camera can never lie, so whatever emotions people show are therefore genuine. There were many photographs taken of women with so-called hysteria, kind of a form of mental illness, in a hospital in Paris at Salpêtrière in the 19th century. And the idea is that by taking numerous photographs of these women in various states of emotional distress, acting out, delirium, and so on, you would understand this, and it would become database of mental illness. But at the same time, what happened is people also learned how to act crazy. There was also, it became, people understood in order to, that was the form that I'm supposed to take to get attention, to be recognized for my distress, how my distress registers. That's why people don't do that anymore. I mean, that was Freud's great innovation, that he didn't look at his patients. And once the doctor doesn't look at you anymore, there is no reason to do this kind of hysterical acting out. So to get back to this, there's always this the idea that the camera doesn't lie, which is going on today in much more sophisticated motion tracking, the idea that our faces reveal our emotions really even goes back to like the 18th century and so on. But at the same time, they're not taking into account performance, that the camera also trains people. They train people whether consciously or unconsciously, perform for it. And I just kept feeling like these kind of, these tracking of emotions, which happens, interestingly, which is a computer puts a grid over people's faces with points around the eyes, around the mouth, and so on, and which is not that different to what Murray did in the 19th century. But the idea that that captures the truth, that somehow the face reveals the truth, to me also ignores the fact that will not people train themselves to present certain emotions, to pass through borders, and what will be left is the disturbed and the despondent and the people whose faces fail to conform, which I find actually really kind of horrifying. It's those who cannot correctly perform are going to be left out, left behind, shut out, and so on. Because emotions are also cultural, they're also performative. Esther had a great example. You have to tell about the scary smile story.
Right, yeah. I mean, so because I've been looking into this sort of encounter between emotion and machine for something I was writing, and quite a few stories seem to emanate. I mean, the sort of the scary tech stories come from China and Amazon, basically. And if you want to see the future, you look at Amazon patents for what they want to do. But the stories related to work come out of Japan, certainly Japan in the 90s and 2000s, where smiling in the workplace became a very important characteristic, such that there's a rail company where all its employees had to smile into a machine each morning and then be given a printout which would assess their smile on a scale of 1 to 100 and then give them instructions how to smile better. But this seemed to lead to something that a psychologist in Japan diagnosed as smile mask syndrome. And this was affecting young women in the service industry, waitresses and so on, some of whom were his students, I believe. And they had to smile all day. They had to perform this emotional labor, some people call it, or affective labor. And then they found they couldn't stop smiling. The smile had stuck. Even when they were relating really distressing, terrible stories, they were still smiling. So you get locked. This performance, it kind of becomes you. I mean, it raises all these questions, as I think things like emotional labor theory and so on do, about the authentic self and what are authentically felt emotions, and are all, if you produce an emotion, you get that in COD psychology, don't you? Make yourself smile, it takes more muscles to frown, make yourself smile and you become happy. That sort of positive psychology stuff, but the way it sort of flips into a kind of hysteria, I suppose.
I mean, I always feel terribly sorry for these people who have to be store greeters. Like, they're paid minimum wage and they have to stand at the front of the stupid store and smile at you. And there's always part of me that just wants to go up and say, listen, it's okay, you don't have to do this, it's all right. And then I think that's probably just going to cause it more of a problem, and I just have a trouble every time I encounter this, because I feel like you don't have to do it for me. But I know they're getting paid to do it. But then Esther came, I was reading her recent essay, and she had an even much more scary story that goes into the realm, I think, of a whole dystopian science fiction, which is that she's talking about Chinese companies that are monitoring people's brainwaves.
Yeah, so sort of asking, they're developing things there, they're asking workers to put on helmets, and I mean, there's debate over whether this can really work, but the helmets are scanning their brains to look for anxiety, exhaustion, the potential rebellious kind of emotions that would mean either, as in the Gilbreth's motion studies kind of material that Zoe's worked on also in the Infernal Dream of Mutt and Jeff. In an updated version of that, it's about efficiency. So you'll be compelled at that moment to take a 10-minute break and then come back on the job and work better. But in some ways, I mean, that's not so different from what's happening in the US, or not quite on the emotional front, but now many employees are voluntarily, in the US and in Britain recently, it was in the news, having chips implanted in them by their employers, which facilitate, the opening of doors, so you don't need your lanyard and little things like that. But then more and more things start to be put on the chips. You might have your will put on there. You might then start to put your photos on there. And then, of course, the company should know where I am at all times, so it's got a GPS communication. And eventually, you've submitted yourself to become this way beyond a Fitbit, is this body of information, this moving, commodifiable, surveyable point of data moving through the landscape.
But to me, I mean, smile mask or not, at least it's a mask. I believe that every worker should have the right to be alienated. Absolutely have the right to be alienated, whatever your face is doing. And once people start monitoring your brain waves, you are no longer allowed to be alienated on the inside. I think everybody, I'm always alienated on the inside. And
there's no separation, there's nowhere to hide, and there's no cover, is there?
That at least part of me is myself. I mean, I was just thinking, when I was thinking about that, I was thinking we're going again back and forth. We go back. I was thinking there's kind of an important, I think, at the beginning of the 20th century, there's a Russian dystopian science fiction novel called We, and in which it's kind of a city of the future in which if people have the wrong emotions, there's X-rays that will take your emotions out of you. And so once you can monitor people's brainwaves, then you can change people's brainwaves. And then there's nothing left of you left. So it gets scarily close to the, We was really the beginning of like Brave New World and all these kind of dystopian science fiction films that we, that kind of have sprung from that. But I don't want to be entirely dystopian. I want to see, in my show, I also want to talk about, well, what different ways could things and people interact?
That's what I find so interesting, the evocation of animation, and this sort of 1920s animations, which in a way stand there and they're physically, the laughter coming from ha 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 is sort of, spilling over the room, and the sort of catchiness of these images produces a very, it's slightly hysterical in a sense, but there's a different emotional atmosphere and flavour produced through them. But I was wondering, do they act ambivalently in the sense that would you say in that moment, in the 1920s, I suppose kind of standing halfway in a sense between now and that onset of a kind of surveillance, technologized, industrial, machinic capitalism. It's sort of in the middle point, looking, maybe forwards and backwards itself as a contribution to modernist culture, self-consciously modern, thinking about technology. So in some ways, these really lively objects that happen in animation they're both anarchic and potential and crazy, but they are also an instaging of what Marx would have called the fetishism of commodities, and the sense in which through that period what happens to the human is this sort of reduction of themselves, ironically enough, to thing status, while the things are where it's all happening. They are the important parts of life, the commodities that we want to buy. So for you, when you use those animations, are they critical? Are they multi-meaning?
Well, they are. I mean, yes, they. You're right about Marx. When objects become too lively, and people are reduced to things, that's exactly that transition the whole show talks about. But I picked out those cartoons. There's one called The Little Screw that was made in Soviet Russia in 1927, and the other one was made by the Fleischer brothers. It's a Betty Boop cartoon called Ha 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 from 1934. Because I kind of loved them, and I thought they actually are very disruptive of the status quo. It's in the Soviet one, it's an animation about heavy machinery, which was like the latest thing in Russia, like big factory machinery. And the machines, some of them, the big machines start bullying the little screw, and he walks off the job, and of course nothing goes right. The machines cry oily tears, and then they have to find a new way of being together. So it's about how things like people can find communal ground. I mean, there's something very tender and very sweet about it, rather than kind of some top-down bosses coming and telling everybody what to do and get back to work. That people like machines can work it out amongst themselves and be a collective and be better to each other. There's something very tender about that. And I mean, obviously it was for children, but I love the fact it was shown along with Battleship Potemkin to show that even a little screw could stand shoulder to shoulder with a great battleship. Wow. It was a revolutionary film, but a very tender one. Mm-hmm. It was a very tender and communal revolutionary film, which, in the face of Stalinism would all be destroyed. Mm. And then the rebellious technology of Ha Ha Ha, when laughing gas is let loose, that it infects like Brooklyn at rush hour, and suddenly the workday just grinds to a halt, and machines just go crazy, and like they become revolutionarily naughty and sexy and out of control, and people just fall around laughing instead of being like productive workers. Mm-hmm. There is something about revolutionary laughter that I think is kind of, rather than revolutionary violence, just tickles me.
And I like the way, I mean, again, it's a cloud of gas, it's an atmosphere that's produced that then becomes contagious, so everybody's kind of falling about.
It is an atmosphere.
As an animation nerd, I was intrigued to see it's a mix of live footage and drawn cell animation. Mm-hmm. Did Betty Boop often do that?
Yes, there's a lot of the Fleischer brothers, even more, I think, the early Coco ones, where live action and animation is mixed together.
Because in a way that sort of, it echoes back to me at the way you sort of work as well, between kind of film and photography and drawing, and sort of bringing these things together, and the way you translate images from photographs into drawings, or the filmed emojis that you have that have turned sort of drawings or animated avatars into live faces and so on. So that kind of fluidity between forms.
Yes.
I mean, is that...
the Fleischer Brothers films and those animation and live action films for like 20 years have been like super important to me and inspiring. And I get my students to do like live action and animation together. And I kind of, that things become too lively, and I don't know. It's just, it works for me.
Because I was wondering about this idea of a kind of imitation or mimeticism in a way, that in a sense that drawing could be a kind of imitation, or the way you're sort of using it. So, you imitate the emoji in another form, or you imitate it in the crowds and in the clouds and so on. And so I was wondering, I mean, is there something also about, is one of the energies, I suppose, of the modern epoch and our time to do with a kind of mimeticism, which in a bad way or in a sinister way manifests itself in smart technology, which is imitating us and which presses more and more through natural language and so on to become
human-ish.
Yes.
The way Alexa and whatever talks to you, and Sweet talks
or
to
the
you.
Barbie that you talk about, who's going to be your little daughter's best friend and confidant and so on. And is there a kind of counter hex or something on that through trying to mobilize other modes of imitation, or the way in which you use old film footage, but because of the way you set it in motion, we read it against itself, or other information comes out of it. It itself becomes a sort of disruptive object.
I think I love early animation because it's completely unlike the real world, and it's very graphic. I mean, I think of drawing as thought at work. I've always thought of drawing as thinking in action, whether it's animated drawing or just drawing. And whereas we find that with kind of in the modern world, as I say, animation kind of sneaks up on us and becomes kind of more and more pseudo-real. A lot of it's like Avatar.
All that CGI
animation, yes, that becomes more and
more rounded, and a sort of a gravitational universe, and all of that anarchy and craziness of early cartooning disappears.
And I find that really depressing. So, like, the most sophisticated emoji, they develop, they get more and more realistic. And that's why you see these big emojis in my exhibition, which are actually filmed people. It's like people's DNA has merged with them. Mm-hmm. Like, if you look at the very first emoji from like the late 1990s, they're very simple pixels because that's what the technology was. But now they become kind of shiny and glossy, and then they'll become more and more human-like. My idea is like, as we become more like them and they become more like us, these DNA mergers start to happen. So I'm very, very suspicious of these things that kind of insinuate to be like us, like, as I say, Alexa or Barbie, talking Barbie, or any of these things. Mm-hmm. But yes, the wild, anarchic, anti-naturalism of early cartoons is like super inspiring, and in part why I drew a lot, because it has energy in the way that modern CGI does not.
Yeah, it's even that, the kind of boilingness and quiveringness of early cartoons. It seems to hold a certain excitement, that the rather plodding ways in which a lot of contemporary animation looks the same now as well, doesn't seem to have that.
As you pointed out in your book, like with Snow White, and gravity took hold, and then the magic all just dissipated.
Since 1937. Yeah. And I suppose, I mean, as I've been thinking about the ways in which emojis have insinuated themselves into our lives, that there are also these other kind of forms, like, or the push within the smartphone, for example, is to be able to look at it, and it uses these facial tracking technologies to sort of instantly create an emoji or an animoji, animal forms, based on your own face, and these have movement contained within them. So you know, in some ways, everything, we're all engaged in these animations, but they're set out according to very limited parameters, and it's like coming back to the 5 or 6 emotions in Facebook, or what they call the Likert scale, that we're often asked to rate things on a scale of 1 to 5 between, you know, excellent and bad, or happy and unhappy, and so on. So that kind of, on the one hand, there's a sort of sophistication of the technology that makes these things mobile and more 3D, and on the other hand, a sort of paring down
infantilization of us.
Yeah, yes, totally infantilized.
I mean, smart technology plays upon that at all. Like, it promises your house is safe and warm, and the lights turn on and welcome you, and it's going to take care of your baby, and.
But and isn't that? I mean, that's almost, it's the promise contained in the name. It can be smart, so we can
be dumb.
Babies. Yeah, we can be idiots, and it takes care of all of that and puts us back into that infantile position.
Where the fridge knows what we want.
But
I kind of hypothesize what happens with the washing machine, like, eats our clothes.
Well, exactly, because there's always the capacity for breakdown.
Yeah, because maybe we should buy new clothes.
Yeah, but I mean, does it all work so smoothly? I mean, your parody film of IBM is just extraordinary, and the sense, and again, it's this imitation kind of aesthetic. So we begin within the world of IBM, and very simple kind of aesthetic for something that's, you know, a massive global firm. You know, they can put together a fairly easy to imitate kind of video, and then you take it off in these directions which aren't making it untrue, it's making it more true. You're exposing what is really underneath in terms of the direction of this Internet of Things, in which our washing machines are talking to our light bulbs, are talking to our Amazon Prime account.
of it as kind of a psychoanalytic interpretation of objects. I mean, Matt and Jeff was a lot about that. If objects could talk and think, what would they show us? I mean, I'm a medium, a conduit to reveal these things that are there.
Yeah, but it's not what they
want us to know.
Yeah,
but it's
I mean,
there.
there's a surface in which they're interacting with each other, and apparently, if not with us, then through us, and they're ordering our toilet roll and doing all the things that we delegate to them. But there's this speculation then that there's a kind of technological unconscious which is really revealing what this is all for and what's at stake here. I mean, what would you say, what is the motivation? Is it purely money? Or is it something more about a conception of society and how it should be ruled?
I mean, its surface is all money. I mean, that's what the original IBM commercial is just about, how to, if you use the Internet of Things, your company will be more profitable, your sales will go up, and all that kind of stuff. That's a surface, but what it's not showing us is how through that we ourselves are changed. And that's kind of the level in which I was interested in it.
Yeah.
Which it may not even know itself.
Yeah.
That's why it's an unconscious, something that it does not even, or IBM does not even know.
And again, I mean, the name's revealing, isn't it? Because Internet of Things, in a sense, includes us as a thing, or it should be called Internet of Humans, or something else, but somehow we and our desires are excluded and exchanged for purchases or something else.
And they taught to talk to each other behind our backs. And sometimes we don't even know that's what, like, these deep machine learning things are. It's like people don't even know what it's thinking.
Yeah.
It just spits out something, and nobody, even the people who built it, have any clue, like, where that comes from.
Yeah.
It can solve problems, but nobody knows how, or which is interesting. But maybe we're talking a lot. Maybe people have questions or thoughts they want to share, or this is a load of hogwash. We're open to everything.
Hi Zoe, my name is Jude. I was wondering, as a creative, when you're working on certain things that have that can have a darker side, such as mental health and the effects and how deep it goes, do you find that it comes at a cost to create the art that you do? And in the process, does it emotionally wear you away, or do you find a release?
That's an interesting question. I think for this show, I kind of have a black humor, so there was a lot that was kind of humorous to me. I didn't get really upset, and there were things that I really loved, like The Little Screw and the Betty Boop films, and so I wanted to show the darker side, but also a lighter side. I mean, it's interesting because I'm doing a project now that's actually fairly different, and it talks about a lot of bad things that's going on where I live. I live in the United States, and sometimes I'm painting them, making pictures of, for example, where children are separated from their parents at the border, and sometimes I really feel sad, and I feel like even though I'm painting things that are really painful, yeah, sometimes it really gets me down. I wish I wasn't doing it, but I feel like you can't look away sometimes from bad things. You have to respect them and record them. And just to paint a happy sunrise, it just doesn't, it's not helpful. I want to be honest, and I want to look clearly at the world around me, so.
I was just curious to hear your views on selfies. I suppose what I picked up on the idea that civil liberties, human rights, potentially there are issues with those two areas with regards to how we monitor facial expressions and implants. So it made me think about selfies. Are they a radical free expression, or are they, in a sense, almost like an evolutionary stage of self-control?
I certainly think the latter. I'm fascinated by the ways in which we perform for the machine. So even something like the smile, has been brought about. We smile for the camera, but then there are historical waves, initial photography, you're meant to keep a very straight face, and partly that was to do with the technology, and as the lenses got faster, then you could hold on to momentary expressions more easily. But it's really strange with the selfie. We've almost gone back to very early forms of photographic composure and the highly regulated face. And then you have waves within that, don't you? Initially it was the fish face, and then the duck gape, or there are fashions whether you show teeth or don't show teeth, and quite how you angle it. So these things are highly socially controlled, and they're highly performed, and of course highly edited. I mean, people become editors of themselves, presumably. What fascinates me about them is where is all of this stuff going to go? I mean, it's gone up into a nice cloud, making all these emotions that we're going to see in 20 years when it's reached some sort of peak and learned how to express itself. But does anyone look at their own selfie ever again?
I know. It's like people take photographs. Do they ever look at them? It's the act. It's a performative thing. People perform. I mean, people confess and people conform. People don't, people take naked pictures. They're constantly. They don't need much prompting, to confess their bodies themselves. It's strange, really.
Yeah, there's a lot of sharing and exposure,
Yes.
and that's partly where this whole reactions economy comes from, and this whole sort of emotions economy, because as good time motion study people, they've also internalized that you need to do this speedily. So just press that button and you tell someone wow or sad or whatever.
my questions possibly over Esther. Esther, you talked about capturing the data of emotions in the workplace. It seemed to be that was seen as quite a negative thing. I work in a corporate environment, and I like to think, that sometimes that data is captured to create a more positive workplace. Have you got examples of where that was the case, or do you think it tends to have more of a negative connotation?
I think there will be. I could imagine an office, and I've been in them where, or as an academic, a lot of us envy in certain ways. Envy the people who work together in the admin team, because they talk to each other a lot during the day. They have cake and biscuits, and there's an atmosphere, and they laugh, and we're all in our separate little silos doing emails most of the time. And I'm not saying that they are not working. They work really hard, and they are brilliant. But they're generating a sort of atmosphere themselves in which there are certain kinds of importance set by mood and team mood. But I suppose for me, it's once it becomes what they call software as service, where you've exported this out to someone to produce a software program whereby atmosphere and mood is monitored either surreptitiously or by stealth through perceptual user interfaces, where your expression on your face is being recorded, uploaded, analysed to see how often during the day do you look engaged, attentive, or even happy at work, or where you're being asked to register your emotions. I think in a sense that I don't know if that can ever work to genuinely produce something good, or the question is what's it about. So when you press or don't press these happy or not buttons at the airport or in your cafe, someone's reading that data, and if there are too many negatives pressed, somebody's going to take the rap for that. Someone has to be answerable. And so that's a mechanism for trying to ensure that the person does their fake smile at you, even though they're feeling awful. So do we have to be complicit in this and as an act of solidarity, always press the good? But then again, often, you want to press the bad because you don't like the very fact that we have to go through security at an airport, or someone was miserable to you. So, I'm not sure. I'm sure, or I would be happy to hear about places where this kind of tracking could work positively. I'm sure it might be able to identify problems within the workplace. But then you get into this organizational method that came out of Japan in the 90s from Toyota, Kaizen, continual improvement. And so when you see team mood and these softwares that want to monitor mood in the workplace, they always propose that we can continually make things better. And sometimes that kind of ideology in the workplace is exhausting, and we all know that it's often phony, really.
One of the things I like about the exhibition is that it presents itself in a very colorful and welcoming in way, but then sort of tells you horrible things. So it lures you in and saying, come here, and then you get gut punched. But what I was thinking of, we talked about sort of the reduction of our emotions to only a few set available ones. And I was thinking, sorry, about your previous work about Brecht and Eisenstein, and how they were constantly inventing new methods of communicating and a new way of sort of using media. And so thinking, could you imagine the way, let's say through emojis or other forms of media, we could have a new visual grammar that could express feelings like solidarity or support or a wider range of emotions? And if we could, would that be a good thing? Or would it just be a further intensification of minute control?
That's an interesting, unanswerable question. I feel like everybody should have their own emojis that they make themselves. There should be no standardization. I mean, I love pictures and I love to draw, so, you know, there should be free pictography for all. There is no solidarity emojis, but there should be. I don't, you know, it's a hard question, but there should be. I have to, sometimes when I send emoji, I have to send like 15 at once, because just to get the ball rolling, you know, which means I can only send them to Eric, because like only he can get a flood of them. But there's never enough. There's never enough. Maybe it is there's too little. Maybe it should be in excess. I don't know.
But as you say, that kind of granularity could just lead to more, you know,
misunderstandings.
Yeah, or people, you know, more extraction, just a finer grading. Of
Yeah,
the sort of
more extraction is always bad.
I find the film Emoji really interesting, because it's all around this character who's the meh emotion of indifference, and so what is the role of that? I mean, it's a problem within the film, but it's sort of resolved within the film, and in a way there's room perhaps for indifference. But you know, what do we can we come to terms with sort of no emotion, you know, feeling completely affectless, or is that disastrous?
I mean, just to come back to Stephen, when you mentioned Brecht, I mean, in a Brechtian actor, the idea is not to feel the emotion, to be at one with the emotion, but to present the emotion. So you are not the emotion, which is kind of an interesting idea, whereas today we're expected to be the emotion, assumed to be the emotion. And in fact, he was very, very suspicious of emotion as a form of communication, because it kind of, it eradicates thinking.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not, we should think and not just be slaves to our feelings, whereas the companies just want our feelings, not our thoughts.
Yeah.
Thank you. And in this discussion, I'm not sure I understand the difference between emotion and thoughts, because it seems to me there are very blurry distinctions between the two. And all the time there's been this discussion about emotions as if they're, I don't know, a scale of things we can use images to describe, and in fact it's far more subtle than that. So I'm not sure that an image of a face has anything to do with emotion. It's a bit like reducing it to the point where it is no longer possible to discuss it. So I'm troubled by, I don't understand, how would you define what an emotion is? It's not just about being happy or sad or angry or frustrated. It's so much more subtle, I think.
But I think that's the
exactly
point,
the point,
isn't it?
yeah.
Because there's emotions which are marketed to us or you know, laid out in these emojis. Right. And I think, you know, both of us would say that this cannot capture the fluidity of emotions. It's not just that we might have subtle emotions. You can change from being sad to happy in a moment, or you can be both at once, or that German Schadenfreude.
Those are very nice, little, neat descriptions of something which, as I said, it seems to me that the relationship between thought and emotion is so much deeper, so much more profound. And I'm not sure what we should be afraid of, because I don't think those things can be measured or quantified in any way. And they're so individual that there's this...
But whether you like it or not, that's what business uses to quantify. You might disagree they don't capture you at all, but they captured something. And they use that. It's a practical thing. Not that we think it's accurate. It's not.
It's a bit like the birth of statistics, which, you know, set up these kind of ideal types which represented no one, and yet that's what's instituted. That's what becomes the measure against which all of individuality is measured, or the scale against which they're set, and that has effects. I mean, what might be hopeful in what you say is that this actually is a dream that cannot work.
That's what I've been kind of
Yeah,
trying to say.
yeah, yeah. And I would hope that. I mean, you know, in the sense that Facebook targets its advertising at me, I ignore it. I don't think it works on me, but then...
Well, plus the fact that when you're putting something in Facebook, you might well choose a symbol, but you also write text, and the text can say a lot more and convey a lot more complexity about what you're feeling, thinking, than the image can.
It can, but then that text will also be scanned for certain buzzwords which will determine what adverts you're sent tomorrow. So we're sort of locked into this. Well, it is extremely sophisticated, sadly.
Can I make another point in that? So, I haven't seen the exhibition yet, and apologies, I've come straight to the talk, and then that will hopefully inform me. I'm just thinking there's also a nostalgia for a certain kind of cinema coming through. When you talk about the early kind of animation and certain kinds of cinematic experiences that are from a long time ago. And it seemed to me that I don't know whether that nostalgia is getting in the way of
appreciating the present?
Yeah.
I don't think things have to be the way they are. I don't think I think I can use, to me, they're helpful thought experiments that I can use in the present day in my own work and can show that animation doesn't have to be the way it is today. It can be another way. It might yet be another way that's not the past and not the present, but could be in the future. That's why, like, I encourage my students to work with animation and live action and often very crude materials, to posit another way forward rather than just embrace what we have in the moment. Yeah. You could be nostalgic, but I think it can be also productive.
Well, I don't like to think of it as nostalgia. I mean, maybe I wouldn't like to, but for me, I think there's a sense in which there are paths, that the past still has potentials, things that weren't followed through, things that came to an end and didn't get a chance to develop further. And so to sort of pick something out of the trash can of the archive is to release an energy into the present that might affect the present. So I don't see us as cut off from that.
It's like the Fleischer brothers, to me, were much more radical filmmakers than Walt Disney. Walt Disney got ahead and made his kind of adenine, family-friendly kind of cartoons, and the wild, sexual, Fleischer brothers, with their jazz scores were kind of stomped on for various political reasons, actually. And I think they still radiate some energy that we can, use productively. Things do not have to be the way they are. Did not have to turn out that way.
Hi. I don't quite know how I'm going to get into the sort of meat of this, but I'm trying to put Disney with Office. You were quite interestingly talking about relationships between moralizing and diagnostics at a certain point. I'm quite interested in how commodifying is also a form of kind of moralizing, and that there's this kind of proximity between diagnostics and governance and all these things sort of tying together. And I'm remembering being a child in the Disney offices because my grandfather worked for Disney, and how there was this kind of really horrible moment with a moralizing animal when we used to come in, and when children came into the offices, somebody would dress up as one of the characters. And this was supposed to be fun, but very quickly became terrifying because they didn't stop telling their secretaries what to do, or doing the filing, or telling us not to get marker on the carpet, or whatever. So you'd get this Pluto, who perhaps started off as cute, and then became a kind of horrific figure of non-fun very, very quickly.
I think it's Adorno's worst nightmare comes true.
But I felt like some of that was kind of embedded when you're talking about cuteness and not being cute, and how quickly that turn is, and that drawing is such a brilliant kind of articulator of that as well, of the betweenness between those things, which is so prevalent in the work. But yeah, the Office was fantastic.
That's
you know.
an amazing
Maybe
story.
a bit. Yeah, the crazy, scary Pluto. I've got to bring it up.
Hey there, I was just wondering what your view was on the use of animated GIFs as a means of communication, because you seem to really enjoy animation and stuff like that, and it is something which is becoming a lot more prevalent on Facebook as well as on other social media networks. And obviously you can say a lot more with a short animated image from something like a film or an animation or a reality TV show, and also it might be harder for the algorithms to quantify because it's up to interpretation what the person in that short animated clip is saying and what emotion they're trying to convey with that. I was just wondering whether that was something that you'd noticed in your research and had any thoughts about.
I've been looking at GIFs a little bit because I'm fascinated by the cycling of them, the sort of looping, which I always find something, because what I always notice is the join, the arrest of it, that the movement stops and starts again. And I find that quite melancholic or frightening in a way. And I came across some of the really early photographs. I think they were Maret's photographs, which had been sequential, and someone had animated them into a loop. So effectively a 19th century GIF, and it was of an insane, crippled person walking. It's kind of heartbreaking, almost, because movement is included. I think this really changes how things speak to us. So I've felt this poor person who'd been a sort of object of study had been sort of trapped in this infernal loop, basically, of movement. And obviously, GIFs might not have that sort of power, or that effective power, because they're not a real person trapped in a mental asylum in 1870.
We could say that Sisyphus was the first animated GIF.
Yeah, in a sense, it's just, this eternal infernalism, I think, just sort of sticks with every kind of GIF. But they're also really funny, and as a mode of kind of commenting and opening up these modes of communication online, I do think they're really interesting, and memes and all this sort of internet native vocabularies that do, I think it's suggested, spring off in all sorts of directions, and in a sense are as uncontrollable as a Betty Boop 20s animation.
If you scan the objects in my exhibition, you scan the QR codes, a few animated GIFs will appear. They're hidden right now, but they'll pop out at you. I'll let you find them.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Zoe and Esther. That was brilliant.
Well, thank you for great questions and really smart thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.